introduce our next speaker, next panel. This speaker, she is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Innovator. She's an award-winning journalist for the last 40 years. She's been covering global tech and World Economic Forum for the last 20 years. She's worked at companies like Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, International Herald Tribune, Red Herring, and Business Week. So she's also been listed in the top most inspiring women with Forbes and Tech EU. So really excited to have her here leading this panel, Jennifer Schenker.
We're very lucky to have with us here today Dr. Rob Smith to my immediate right, and Jakob Mökander. And just by way to put their comments into context, Rob has been working in AI for over 30 years, and he mostly in the aerospace industry, but also in other sectors. He has worked in academia, also as an entrepreneur, and he is the author of an AI book called Rage Against the Machine that deals with AI and discrimination. So welcome, Rob. And then we have Jakob, who also has an incredible AI background. He worked for the Swedish government and stationed in both Delhi and Vienna. He did his PhD at Oxford in AI governance and ethics, and he has done work with AI audits with OpenAI and the pharmaceutical industry. And he spent 1 year at Princeton University in the US, also looking at technology and management of technology. And now his job at the Tony Blair Institute kind of brings all those dotted lines together. So welcome, Jakob, and let us jump right into our conversation. Rob, let me start with you. What are the key components of AI infrastructure at most firms today?
So some of these things are going to be familiar, some of them aren't. Certainly, we start off, I wouldn't call this a stack, I'd call it a chain. So you start off with the data handling and data storage aspects of infrastructure. Then you move into communications. Then you move into processing, particularly compute power, GPUs, TPUs, effectively high performance computing of various kinds. On top of that sits data handling frameworks first, because there's a great deal of data handling necessary for modern AI. Then you get AI frameworks, and then you get MLOps. Now I'll talk about MLOps last, but the thing about all those components up to the AI frameworks piece is effectively any data-intensive application would have the same components of infrastructure. It's not unusual infrastructure, it's usual infrastructure. When you get to the AI frameworks piece and then the MLOps piece, slightly different things happen. Now, in many ways, what's going on in AI today, a lot of the AI frameworks pieces have in fact been as commoditized as the rest of the stack. Effectively, there's innovation going on there, but there's lots of tools and components that people use over and over again, and there's providers that have good tools that they put in that space. Then finally, there's the MLOps space, and I want to tell you what that is, and then I'll make some comments about who the providers are. So in the MLOps space, what that really means, those of you who know what DevOps is effectively integrating the idea of continuous software development into the idea of operations, sometimes with feedback loops, like for instance, the A/B testing of features, right? That's what DevOps really is. Now, MLOps is slightly different. And the thing that makes it different is this, is when you've got models that are doing inferencing for you, sometimes they go wrong. And they can go wrong in a couple of ways. They can become stale. Effectively, the data sets on which they were trained can no longer be the right thing. Another way they can go wrong is you can have biases or error problems that you didn't anticipate that effectively you have to respond to. Now, what that requires is model retraining. So you get a loop that goes sort of back to the beginning of your whole data handling chain. So these are tools that you didn't need in the past in the DevOps world that you do need now in the MLOps world. Now, let me talk a little bit about providers. The whole stack up to MLOps, everything before that, the big players, Microsoft, Amazon, it's the list that was on the previous slide in many ways, with maybe a couple of others, Oracle and a couple of others added in there. They own the space in many ways. The space of infrastructure provision and those kind of things is very much owned by very few companies. Now, the place where innovation, I think, is in the AI framework piece, there's innovation happening there for sure, but in many ways the big platform players provide this commoditized infrastructure pretty well. The MLOps space, there's actually a lot of company-based innovation still going on there. That's not sorted yet, I'd say, and there's still a lot of innovation to be had about what companies are the key providers. I can name a couple that they're doing good stuff now, but I think that's a moving target still about how MLOps is provided for. So I hope that kind of begins to answer the question.
It does, thank you. And Jakob, I want to ask you to jump in, and I also realize that I did you a bit of a disservice because I failed to mention that you also have an engineering degree, and so you can go at this from both a technical and policy side.
Yes, but I think maybe to complement that great start, we looked at this from the company's perspective. I can say, so at the Tony Blair Institute, we work with governments around the world. So we think about the same part of the stacks, especially the first 4 layers that you mentioned, but what political leaders can do to put in place a necessary component that are needed for such innovation ecosystem to flourish. And for various reasons, this has become a harder and harder job in the past few years, not least due to the regulatory fragmentation that we're seeing in the space. So just to give some concrete example, the Tony Blair Institute, we are advising 40-odd governments around the world. Most of these are so-called non-aligned countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Asian countries like Singapore and United Arab Emirates. And these countries sometimes face a challenge. How quickly do we move in digitalization? Do we, for example, digitalize our healthcare system with our digital health records to do all the innovation we can do when it comes to, for example, preventive and predictive healthcare? Similarly, when it comes to the center of government function and national security. And many of them are hesitating because to find the right layers of protection between national and digital sovereignty and the efficiencies that are needed at the application layer, it's hard to do in practice. And we're even seeing that people are politically abstaining from investing in this infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We are publishing a compute report that is coming out next Monday, where we have mapped with novel data the national compute access across 100 countries around the world. And just to give you a sense of proportion, if you exclude China, we could not find data from China for various reasons. US is out investing the rest of the world combined in data center investment. So not just the European Union versus US, but the rest of the world combined, including UK, Middle East, Asia, except China. We're also seeing a huge concentration in that, for example, if you look at where the shipments of the goes, the export controls are really making a difference, especially on the most advanced ships. So even if it's not in the US, it's in very controlled geographies that are with the key players that you mentioned, those that were on the list before. So why am I saying all this? It's like, in order to make the innovation ecosystem flourish, we need not just think of the technical stack, we also need to think about the geopolitical consideration around that. And what we believe are good policies that can facilitate this is things like mutual compatibility and interoperability of platforms and ecosystem. It's movement of people and capital, so the talent visas that we're talking about in the UK context, for example, to get the right engineers and developers in place where you need them. We're also seeing such regional clusters building of shared compute in parts of the world. One of the challenges that is going in that direction is many of the parts of the world have lack of compute access are also the part of the world where there might be regional conflicts. So the development of such shared compute clusters are even more challenging. But I think the key part just to say here is that for especially those parts of the stack that are generalizable and the same for all data-driven technologies, that is where we see governments should invest and also give that shared platform upon which entrepreneurs and developers such as you in the room can build.
So where do you see, how do you see government's role in ensuring that we have a fair playing field? Because we We have a situation both with cloud and also with LLM models. With cloud, recently Google, who's one of the smaller players, filed a complaint with the EU against Microsoft, accusing them of increasing their prices by 400% for any company that wanted to move off of the Azure platform. And this came just a few months after they actually settled with an industry group representing European cloud providers. And Google obviously wasn't part of that settlement. So that's on the cloud side. On the LLM side, there is a disproportionate representation by US companies, and there are sovereignty issues, obviously in places like Europe. What can and should be done about that? And, does Trump's election bring more kind of uncertainty into the mix?
Gosh, ask me the easy question, why don't you? So, as I said previously, there is a dominance by a few players in the provision of infrastructure fundamentally. It's interesting to note that around large language models, and which implicitly involve that infrastructure, the Competitive Markets Authority here in the UK has issued a report. It's probably 5 or 6 months old now, where they express concern about the dominance of these few players in the market. And it is a concern. It's something that I think governments will have to act on. I think that if you look at past antitrust movements by governments. It's interesting, I found out this week that trust actually was a synonym for monopoly when the term antitrust was actually founded. So people thought as trust as monopoly fundamentally. So antitrust actually means anti-monopoly legislation. And you'll know that the Justice Department has had one case against Google now, and I think for ads. They're doing ad search, and they'll eventually do AI. So I do think there will be antitrust movements, and we'll have to see how that sorts out. There are other issues with regard to the dominance of a few players. The dominance of a few players means the dominance of fewer cultures, which is very important. And as Jakob was saying, interestingly, there are competing things here. There are leapfrog opportunities for countries outside of the U.S., etc. But there are also dominance problems. I'll mention this as an aside because I think it's something I'm very interested in. What the LLM revolution is founded upon is the capturing of semantics and how successful that has been, linguistic semantics. The impact on minority cultures and endangered languages is something I'm very interested in because there's a real opportunity there. But it depends on a lot of infrastructural things. So it could be that we have an opportunity to preserve the knowledge of cultures that might be lost if we don't allow the dominance of just a few cultures over the infrastructure.
Thanks, Rob. Jakob, do you want to add to that?
Yes, but there were quite a number of tangents to take this on. Let me actually follow up on two different strands. The first is the point you said about Google search. I'm sure many of you have noticed on your phone and on your browser that when you type in your normal Googling line, you first get the AI summary on the top. And this actually works in a fundamentally different way, right? Because before you had the linkages to the link, but it was up to the human to screen and assess the sources for trustworthiness and for recognizability. But the AI summary, what it does, it looks, what is the consensus we can find among the top sources? But the interesting part, there is an editorial function behind that because you don't get up the answer for all questions. So for example, if I Google who won gold medal in rowing in 1994, I will get an answer because there is a consensus among the sources. But if I ask something was the Russian medaling in the 2020 election significant? There will not be. And then the question is, when does these hyperparameters and those design choices that go in to determine the line between what is search and what is generative AI become an editorial decision? And that has legal implication. But this is something that will develop over time, and I think that Google is still doing experiments with how much to summarize with AI and for what kinds of queries. So that was one tangent. On the second one, on the regulatory implication also of the recent election in the US, I think there are when we talk about AI governance, we have to keep in mind that these are in fact very many different fields. So for example, we're talking antitrust and competition law, we're talking product legislation. So the EU AI Act is fundamentally product legislation. If you look at the UK AI bill that has been announced, from AI safety, that has to do with national security concern. And all of these things are important: competition law, product law, national security. But it might not necessarily be helpful to collapse them all into one lens and call it AI regulation. So personally, I'm a firm believer that we do need good regulation in the age of AI, and we need to rewrite and update the law so that they reflect the realities in each sector. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the solution to that will be very broad, horizontal, and heavy AI regulation. The final thing I should say here, just on this, to plant the mental image anyway. I don't know if you have read the recent book AI Snake Oil, come out by two professors at Princeton, by Professor Ivan Narayan, he's a computer scientist. He said, imagine a world in which we don't have a term for bicycle, cars, and spaceship, and we call everything vehicle. Then we have very uninformed debates where we're saying, are vehicles fast or slow? People disagree. Should we allow vehicles in inner cities? People disagree. And precisely that is the problem right now when we talk about AI regulation and governance. We're talking about vehicles when we need to be talking about spaceship, cars, and bikes in different contexts.
Yeah, that's very good. I have to pick up on the point about, oh gosh, I had a senior moment here. I'm going to let you go back. Sorry. Sorry. No, I know what it was. The subtlety of biases with regard to the AI summary. Thanks for giving me a moment for my senior memory to come back. So here's the thing. I want to explain to people that bias is very subtle. For instance, and without being controversial, on reporting on conflict between two nation states, summarizing what one nation state did versus what another nation state did in that conflict can be very subtle and carry extremely subtle biases, implying that one was more of an aggressor than the other. And I think that in various ways this has been seen forever. When a machine is doing that, it's very different from when a person is doing that. When I read a particular newspaper, I read The Guardian a lot, right? So when I read The Guardian, I know what The Guardian's biases are. I don't always agree with them, but I do know what they are, right? When I read Google's AI summaries, those biases are emergent phenomena for the most part. They're not Google's biases. They're biases that are so subtly embedded in complex, massive training data that they're not only intractable to me, they're intractable probably to everyone. And this is a real concern when that I feel like I have to say something about.
Okay, thanks for that. If we can, I'd love to take the conversation back into the realm of sovereignty and talk about where do we draw the line, but at the country level, but also at the company level, on what needs to be sourced locally and what can be sourced globally. I mean, if AI is going to be the key to everything, and I think everyone kind of agrees it will be, then what needs to be kept in-house?
Yeah, I think that Jacob's going to have the better comments on sovereignty given who he is and who I am, but I will say this. The power of large language models primarily drives from some very clever architecting and a great deal of computation, but also from the ubiquitous availability of data that doesn't cost anything. But a lot of the power of that combination of compute and architecture applied to more focused domains can be really quite extraordinary. For instance, consider engineering design. If we had lots of engineering design data, huge amounts of it, in a field like aerospace, we could probably build now a large aerospace design model that could do very powerful things. However, the difference is the data is in proprietary silos, it's in sovereign silos. So the ability to realize the value of AI is limited by those factors. And there's a huge amount of work to be done between companies and between nations about how do we advance the power of AI through data sharing, and how do we develop technology that allows for effective data sharing, something we try to work on a bit here at DC.
Yeah. I second all of those points, and I would especially say that there is sometimes a bit of a dichotomy between people who emphasize the benefit of AI and people who emphasize the risk, but really there is no use in looking away for the incredible benefit that can be had in particular sectors when they're well designed, as you said. We are of the opinion that you can only realize those benefits if you also have credible policies around things like national security, data privacy, upholding of human rights law and anti-discrimination and anti-competitive. So we basically view that as one enabler, just as we have the technical enablers, whether that is the data source or compute. When it comes to what countries can do, the first thing that I really liked about how the question was framed is what data sources and what can we source where, because this is really a matter of segmentation. Very few countries on this earth can afford to build the full stack internally, and that would also not be good. That would actually push us further down the line of a geopolitical fragmentation. If you think about the very logic around, let's say, the European Union as an example, was to integrate the core resources and dependencies, and that should be a good thing. Then we also need to be realistic and say full global integration at this stage is unlikely, and especially in the short to near future. So what we're working with government to do is to look at what are the different public services that they would like to digitalize or use AI and deliver, and what are the different risk levels and accountability and transparency measures that governments can live with. That will look very different if you are a small European country that is part of the European Union, or if you are, let's say, a country in the Middle East who is non-aligned and who have significant investments from both US and China. The most important thing is to create also local versions. So even though not everyone needs to, for example, develop their own large language model, a lot can be done by fine-tuning on local languages, on local data. For example, it would be a huge mistake to take healthcare algorithms trained in Europe or North America and apply them in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Middle East. And we know this. We mentioned bias before, but this is not an abstract concern. Even within the UK and the US, we have case studies where the same algorithm is 3 times less effective of identifying positive cases, for example, of skin cancer for people with darker skin. So this is just one example. So you both need to segment your use cases, then adopt the technology in the local context. And even so, there might be cases where you want to make some investment in local domestic infrastructure for the most critical cases. And this analogy might not go all the way, but think about, for example, the defense industry. The defense industry has historically been a bit of a protected supply chain so that governments can maintain sovereignty even in case of conflict and escalation. And there will be parts of the digital stack that should be considered at the same level of priority as the defense industry. But that does by no means make this a binary choice for countries to, let's say, shall we import or build a global, should we go cloud or on-prem? There will be a plurality of approaches needed for most countries.
Thanks. So let me turn to you, Rob, to talk about the same this topic, but at the company level. So what role do you see open source playing? Because this is a way that companies can perhaps not be tied to completely to the large LLM providers from the United States, but also help them potentially meet cost and sustainability goals by allowing them the freedom to use small language models when LLMs are not necessary, etc. What's your take on that?
It's interesting that I think last week, or maybe it's a couple of weeks ago, the Open Source Institute came out with their definition of what OpenAI actually is. And it's strong and useful, but it has maybe one problem.
Is Meta happy?
I don't. Meta's happy. I think Meta comes out okay on it. But the thing is the controversial bit. So the non-controversial bits was OpenAI means, first of all, open architecture. So what's the architecture of this model? How are the layers built? How does it connect together? A lot of programmer geek stuff. Second is open weights, the idea of the parameters, these billions of parameters we hear about, making those open. That's another definitional aspect of OpenAI. The last one was the controversial one, was open training data. In order to basically say it's OpenAI, do you need to say, and here's where we got all the training data? In the end, they sort of fudged it. It basically says a technically competent person should be able to recreate the system from scratch for it to be open, which sort of fudges the idea of whether the data should be open or not. Open AI, as it's defined now, is critically important to basically the advancement of AI for lots of objectives, for fairness, for things like sustainability, for ubiquitous use, all those kind of things. However, this data issue is going to continue to nag us, and it brings us back around to the idea of companies. Is the issues of propriety and data ownership are implicit in the way AI is working today. We're trying to work with technologies here about trying to maintain people's data sovereignty and ownership, and helping companies basically be able to share data without sharing things that are private. But those things are still things that are in process. This challenge of, if I can digress for just a moment because it's such a good anecdote, is if you go to Midjourney, I believe it is Midjourney, and you ask it to draw Mario, it will tell you it can't because it's a copyrighted character. If you ask it to draw a cartoon plumber, it draws Mario reliably. And this is true across all the AI models. You can get ChatGPT, or recently you could get it to generate New York Times articles almost word for word. So this issue of ownership of data goes down to the company level, it goes down to the individual level. It is a key challenge within the generative AI of today that we have not yet solved, and it is a key research issue. It's also a key issue about investment and hesitancy to invest and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So what I fully agree with is that we haven't solved the data problem. And in the UK, there will also be a review of data privacy law, especially as it relates to intellectual property and the training of large language models. But I think one thing we should keep in mind, without coming to a sort of premature conclusion, is when we talk about updating regulation in the age of AI, that can cut both ways. That doesn't always mean stricter laws or upholding existing laws. Sometimes digital ecosystem work differently than physical one. We can have resources that are mutually shareable and are non-rivalrous goods and so on that did not work in the physical space. But that was an aside. I also, if I can just follow up a bit on the LLM point, of course, large language model and generative AI has been in many ways helpful to get political leaders and business executives' mind to think about what investments are needed in the stack. At the same time, I would caution both companies and governments to over-index on current model. This particular computational technique did not exist 3 or 4 years back, and in just 3 or 4 years, we might have new kinds of computational techniques, whether they are a hybrid system, multimodal, neurosymbolic system. And I think the key point here is to really, insofar as we're making long-term investment, stick as much as possible to the first 4 or 5 layers in that hierarchy that you outlined in the beginning to create a generative ecosystem and avoid actually locking ourselves in. And the point I'm making here is that this goes both for positive investments in what we want to use technology for, but it also goes for regulation. I would really caution any government about making narrow regulation targeting LLM or generative AI unless they're dynamic enough to follow the trajectory we're seeing in new types of architectures and algorithms.
I have to comment one thing there is a very good shift between EU AI Act version 1 and version 2 was that in version 1 the definition of AI was basically so extraordinarily broad that it covered all of computing, and it was about tech. It was a tech definition. It shifted in the second version to an intention definition. Does it intend to substitute for some human decision-making activity? Is the definitional aspect. And that was key. So that allows for the flexibility Jacob's talking about. We've got to be careful about definitions because if we tie it to a particular kind of technology, it's missing the legal and regulatory point. And the EU did make, I was so pleased when the second version came out because it made this move. And all the regulatory efforts need to think about what they mean very clearly in that way.
Thanks. So let me ask as a follow-on question, Rob. You were saying that for regulation, it's important. The definition now is more geared towards, is the intention to replace a human function, and I think that's kind of a good segue into the next question, which is, how do you see corporates building AI into their workflows?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting. I was saying to Jennifer before this talk, I saw a paper presented yesterday that where someone studied two kinds of AI users, one that they called centaurs and one that they called cyborgs, just as labels. So centaurs in their workflows basically took every aspect of a task that was broken down into a series of tasks and treated each of them with generative AI. They used generative AI all the way everywhere. Cyborgs basically focused the use of generative AI on particular parts of the workflow. And by a narrow but statistically meaningful margin, the cyborgs win. So effectively, the human decision making about where to use the AI was a part of what's good. And I really believe deeply that what we have now is a tool to help us distinguish between when does a machine do this best and when does a human do this best, and make those workflows work. And I think the companies that will succeed and the providers will succeed are the companies that make good decisions about that. Where does it fit the human workflow and enhance the human workflow, not trying to substitute for the entirety of the human workflow, which generally is going to lead to more problems and is not going to get the synergies that are really needed to yield value.
You want to add to that, Jay?
Yes, definitely. So this is an area that we have done a lot of work on at the Tony Blair Institute. And the first thing I should say before I rabble any statistic is any of these statistics that are projections of the future should be taken with a big grain of salt. And they're probably all wrong, but they can give us a sense of proportion. So if you start with the efficiency increase themselves, we're often thinking now of using AI for productivity gain through, for example, generative AI and LLMs and to create documents and text. But even McKinsey, who've been one of the consultancies who have been driving this narrative, in their own report about the potential about generative AI, what they're saying is this will add 30% to the expected productivity increase we would achieve from automation and AI anyway, with or without generative AI. Mm-hmm. So that still shows that 2/3 is still in machine learning optimization, automated decision making, process management, and all that does that also. So even when we say we should use AI to make public service more efficient or to make a company more efficient, generative AI will have some part of that, but there's other computational techniques that are equally or even more important. So that was point number one. Point number two, if we zoom in on generative AI specifically, I don't know how much you are using it in your everyday life. I try sometimes. Sometimes it helps me, sometimes it obscures what I'm trying to do. And what I find is you can use generative AI as an inverted test if you actually know a topic. Because Gen AI helps me a lot when I don't know anything. And if I actually know something about the topic, I find the text that comes out quite unhelpful. But what that shows us is this. To use it as a search engine or to generate ideas is perhaps a limited use case. What I use it for instead is I write the points that I want to say, and then it helps me improve my paragraphs, my prose, it helps shorten it. And generative AI is a much better writer than I am. And our combination in me bringing the insights and the fact, and it helps me craft the messages for different target audiences, can be an incredibly powerful way, especially if we want to create, let's say, multiple products for different audiences, whether that is journalists or political leaders or the public. So I just wanted to make those two comments.
Yeah, great points. That AI definitely can augment humans in the workplace, but I think it'd be interesting to also add in here a word about AI agents, which Gartner is predicting to be the big thing in 2025. They're already being used in call centers and a number of functions, but we're now seeing their use beyond, and we're seeing groups of AI agents orchestrating and working together. And I recently came across an interesting case involving a small insurance company in Europe where they had an entire department nabbed by a competitor, and so they had to kind of run it with chewing gum and string for a couple of months, but during those 3 months they had a AI expert basically build agents to replace the entire team. Now, insurance is, a special market because a lot of these things can be mathematically,
Sure.
done. But what was interesting here is that the team actually outperformed, did twice as well as the human team did. But that was actually a problem because insurance is a regulated industry, and the agents, were able to get so granular that they could predict very well who would be a risk, and rejected too many people. And so the lesson for them was that they had to program the agents to behave within certain guidelines. So I think that's also something interesting for corporates to think about.
Yeah, and it's actually resonates with what Jacob's saying is the old AI is still there, right? The old AI is still there, and in many ways that's what agentic AI is. It's the old AI creeping back in. So what you're really doing is writing fragments of code that do process automation, right? Sometimes in parallel. If you do process automation in parallel, you call it a multi-agent system, right? The agents are working together in some way. That agentic AI is effectively the old AI coming back in, which is great, right? That's that. And it's interesting what you said about insurance in this particular application is, I was saying earlier that there are jobs, processes that in companies run at a certain cadence and in a certain way. When you convert them to automated cadences, they can run faster quite often. But what you discover is that the process automation may have overlooked criteria and steps that you didn't realize you were actually doing implicitly in the slower model. And because of that, this is calling back to ML ops in a bigger way, is that you have to adjust your operations to cope with the idea of ML, right? Because sometimes you can think that you do a bunch of, everybody knows this who works in a real company, I think. You can do process automation and think that it's done that way, but the people who really do it know it's done that way, and then very often you're pausing and saying, okay, this is an exception case. You've got to allow for that in the workflow. And as I was saying earlier, this idea of integration into workflows is absolutely key.
So another aspect that we haven't talked about yet about AI infrastructure is connected to sustainability. And there's not a corporate in the world now that is not under pressure to become greener. And adopting AI, and particularly large language models, is going in the opposite direction. And one of the big issues here is that the providers of these large language models are not very transparent about how much energy, their emissions, how much water they use, and they also measure things differently. There's a lack of standardization on the measurement and also on, the responsibility to report. So how do we fix that?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually take it ahead and be a bit optimistic. I think that we should be aware of that artificial intelligence and computation in general do consume large amounts of energy, and we see this increasing. Just as a benchmark, what we saw in our compute report is in many industrial countries right now, data centers take up roughly 1% of national energy demand. In some countries like Ireland, that is way higher due to the nature of the economy with a lot of also servers. Same in Scandinavia where we have cooling. But my main point is this. Artificial intelligence will on the long term be a net positive for our ability to address climate change, because the energy that goes into this can also be helped to optimize other processes, to solve problem computationally that we otherwise would have struggled with, to find synergies in planning, and also to do a lot of processes that physically would have taken material resources to do and to solve them in a computational realm. And one thing I sometimes do when I think about what are the challenges with artificial intelligence, I divide them into two broad buckets. One is a bucket where technology can play a role in solving, and the other bucket is challenges that will only grow larger the more we centralize and optimize with the risk of technology. And let me say what I mean with that. The energy problem is real, but there are different ways of generating technologies, whether that's renewable, whether that is nuclear, and we will be able to continue to improving on that, whether that takes a decade or two. But if you take other challenges like for example, power concentration in networks or surveillance that come from optimization of data points, these are other challenges with democracy and legitimacy that will only intensify the more technological progress drives us in the direction of artificial intelligence and optimization. So I'm saying is that the energy transition is important and the problems with that are real, but I think compared to the challenges we're facing with power concentration and transparency and democratic legitimacy and control of the system, then I would be less worried about our ability to address that.
So we've got, I mean, the message here is we've got to get the balance right, right? And so we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask you both, like, in 60 seconds to just sum up what you want the audience to take away as your key takeaways.
What to take away is that AI is bigger than just generative AI. I think that's Jakob said that, and I actually agree with that. That the large language model, although an incredible breakthrough that's going to influence us all, is domain-specific models are going to be very important and more complicated to get to come into existence because of various factors, but possibly much more powerful ultimately. And finally, that the integration into human workflows, what does the human do, what does the computer do, and how do we get those to synergize, is the most important pressing research problem and value opportunity.
Jakob, you have the last word.
Yes. In terms of how to think about this transition that is currently ongoing, I think it's back to basis and work with the end in mind, because the more artificial intelligence is underpinning everything we do, the less will it also be a unique selling point to emphasize the role of AI in that. So the question is really, how are we improving on a certain process in, for example, healthcare or drug discovery, or in how we ensure transparency in democratic processes? And AI is one component that goes into that, but it doesn't exhaust it. I often think around AI in the simplest term as one way to represent and solve problems in the computational realm, but the problem is very seldom at the computational realm. That is a translation. So how good is our model of the real world problem we're trying to solve with a mathematical model, and what kind of feedback loop are we getting in from the validation of the mathematical output into the effects of its real world? So you can think of it almost like a transformation between real world problem up to a model and down to verification. So I would say start with what is a real world problem and build in those feedback loops to see if we're actually improving on the status quo. Then it matters less whether we call that up there AI or something else.
Thank you so much. We're out of time. Please give a big hand to our panelists.